Good day, everyone. My name is Ms. Bonnet, and I would be focusing on narrative writing, specifically structuring the plot in a story. Today's objectives are identify the elements of plot structure, summarize the events of a story, and organize plot structure. Today I'm going to tell you a story. Listen carefully. "Mummy, I have a grand story to tell you," exclaimed Bonnet. "Oh, really?" Mummy answered. "Yes, Mummy. At lunchtime, Tamia and I went to the field to play. Mummy, the sun was out in all its glory, and the clouds were waving at me as they sailed across the deep blue sky. The field was alive with cheer and merriment. We all were having fun. Mummy, while playing a game of catch and rescue, a tall, muscular boy approached us. He asked if he could join us, but Nathan said no. The boy fumed with anger. His nose flared and his eyebrows furrowed. He then lifted Nathan and threw him to the ground." "And what happened next?" Mummy asked gently. "Well, we assisted Nathan to get up," Bonnet answered. "Well, Mummy, wasn't that an exciting story?" "Is that the end?" Mummy asked. "Well, you didn't tell me what happened to Nathan. How did he feel? Did he confront the bully?" "Well, Mum, I didn't think that information was important," Bonnet replied. Mummy shook her head and sighed. Why do you think Mummy sighed? Maybe she thought something was missing. If you guessed that, then you were right. What is plot structure? The way a writer sequences the events of a story. The pattern of events in a story is also called the plot structure. Now, this is a basic plot structure. As you can see, it looks like a mountain with a very high peak. The first element is called exposition. The exposition is the beginning of the story. This is where the introduction of the characters and setting is introduced. Next, we have the rise in action. Rise in action. The character goes through some problems and faces conflicts. Conflict can be between man versus man, man versus self, and man versus nature. Man versus man. When you have man versus man, it means simply there's conflict between one person and another. Man versus self. This means there's internal conflict with yourself. And man versus nature. That can be explained, like for example, man versus a storm or hurricane, right? The rise in action then leads to the climax. The climax is the most exciting part of the story where something changes dramatically. This is the turning point of the story. Climax then leads to the fall in action. Falling action is the events that leads to the end of the story. And finally, you have the resolution, where you have the end of the story. Let's read a story and identify its plot structure. The day my doll came alive. The black sky was mysterious that night. The stars were hidden as the darkness crept over the earth. The wind whistled its cold sound. It was the only sound that could be heard. I lay miserably in my bed. I tossed and turned in the blanket as I could not sleep. I looked over at my side table, and there sat my rag doll. She was old, dusty, and useless. Her head fell forward, and then she fell off the table and hit the ground with a loud thud. This did not bother me at all. Soon I felt sleepy and my eyes closed. When I woke up, I was in a forest. It was pitch black and I could hardly see my feet. Then I heard footsteps behind me, big ones. I ran to the nearest tree, hid and peered from behind. It was my rag doll, except she looked like a giant. She was wearing her little Bo Peep's flower dress, and her blonde hair was in two plaits. One eye was closed and the other was open. Her bright blue eyes shone like the moon. She looked straight at the tree and grinned. It looked like she could see right through it. She grinned to reveal her butter yellow teeth as she walked towards me. I ran deeper into the strange forest. She picked up the tree and threw it in my direction. When she realized that she had failed, she began to chase me, saying, "Come, let me destroy you." She kept cackling every time she said that. I was running as fast as I could. My heart was pounding and I could hardly breathe. Even the wind seemed to be laughing at me. Then I realized that the wind was taking the form of people, laughing and pushing me. "Stupid girl," they kept taunting, their voices echoing. I woke up and saw my mother with her hand in mine. It felt reassuring and comforting. "You were having a nightmare," she said. Then I realized I was sweating profusely. I saw my rag doll back on my table, touched it, and it felt ice cold. I could still hear her cold, harsh voice as I held her. Then I angrily threw the doll in the bin, where I hoped she would never haunt my dreams again. From that day on, I learned that my mother will always be there for me and that I should treat others like I'd want to be treated. Can you identify the elements of plot in this story? So we're going to look at the plot and exposition again. Here we are looking at the beginning of the story, which introduces the character and setting. Let's look. In the introduction, the writer identifies the place where the story began. She identifies the time, and she also identifies the mood. Let's look at it carefully. Notice she spoke about the skies being black, and she spoke about night, it being a mysterious night. She also identified the wind that whistled in its cold sound. So we can figure out what type of weather it is. We can also identify her mood, how she felt. She said she was miserable. Here she introduces the main characters, and she gave a perfect description of the doll. Now we are going to look at the rise in action. To create rise in action in a story, we must include events that build tension between the characters. We must also include a series of problems or challenges the main character has to deal with. We also can look at foreshadowing to give the reader hints of what the climax or the resolution might be. And lastly, we must build suspense. So now we're going to examine the rise in action in this story. You would notice that I've highlighted some key areas in this paragraph. Here we saw where it was pitch black. It gives the impression that she was very scared, and also when she heard the footsteps behind her, it created a mood. She looked straight at the tree and grinned. It was like she could see right through it. Now this tells us that the writer is trying to build a tension between the characters. Let's look at the statement carefully. When she realized that she had failed, she began to chase me, saying, "Come, let me destroy you." Now this is an important statement. It actually tells us that the writer is trying to create failure. When I say that, I mean the writer is trying to create a roadblock or prevent the story from going further very quickly. So she creates a roadblock in order to build suspense and also in order to draw the reader into the story. It says she kept cackling every time she said that. It's almost like she's trying to provoke the character. My heart was pounding and I could hardly breathe. Even the wind seemed to be laughing at me. Here you are seeing the intense emotions that is being brought out in the story. Now we are on to the climax. This is the turning point of the story. How can a writer create climax in a story? Firstly, surprise your reader. Then, allow characters' emotions to heighten. Intensify the problem. Create an intense reaction. Make the characters confront each other. I must also insist that you pay attention to this element, because most children forget to put in this element in their story. And of course, it makes you lose a mark. Let's look at her paragraph. Her laugh was like the Joker's as she chased me. A stream of tears ran down my cheeks. She was about to throw a boulder on me. These 3 sentences shows how the problem was intensified. The doll was trying to provoke the narrator. A stream of tears ran down my cheeks. Here you see intense emotions. She was about to throw a boulder on me. And now we have heightened physical reaction. All 3 make up the climax. So we are going to explore the basic plot structure again. Firstly, your story must have an exposition. That is where the story is introduced. You must have characters and you must have a setting for your story. Then your story must have conflict. So make sure you introduce a problem and your characters as well. Then your story must have the climax. The climax is most important to your story. All right? Next, you have the fallen action, where the events that leads to the end and your resolution. How can a writer create falling action? Simply highlight the after effects or consequences of the climax or turning point of the story. Then follow with your resolution. Let's look at our falling action and resolution. So we are at the falling action, which is very close to the end of the story. And these are the events that take place after the climax. At this point, the story dies down and it's coming to a conclusion. Do you remember Benice's story from the beginning of the lesson and how her mother sighed when some important details were omitted? Benice's story lacked climax. She neglected to dramatically describe the confrontation between Nathan and the boy, the tension that occurred, the emotion that everyone experienced as all the events unfolded. This is a common issue that some inexperienced writers have. That is, not to take the time to develop the climax of their stories. Therefore, I strongly advise you to heed the following advice. Include all the elements of the plot when writing a story. Practice proper paragraphing as you organize your elements. Pay attention to the rise in action and climax. Describe your characters' feelings throughout the story. And remember to include some drama and suspense. Thank you for listening.